Story number 1.
I had just turned 20 when I moved into the old house on Chestnut Street. It was my first place on my own, and even though the rent was dirt cheap for such a big house, I thought I had hit the jackpot. The landlord, a thin, elderly woman with frail hands and a voice that quivered like she hadn't spoken in years, had told me I could have the basement apartment for an unbelievable price. I didn't even hesitate when she handed me the keys. The house itself was a large, three-story structure with an old-fashioned charm that made it seem like it belonged in a different time. The walls were decorated with faded wallpaper and the wooden floors creaked underfoot, which only added to its rustic appeal. Everything about it felt cozy, until I found the basement. When I first stepped inside, I was immediately taken aback by the smell. It wasn't exactly musty, but it had a heavy, damp scent, like something that had been sealed in for years. The landlord had mentioned something about the previous tenant being a bit of a hoarder, but I didn't think much of it at the time. The space was large, with low ceilings and a dim, flickering overhead light. There was a single room with a small kitchenette, a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, and a door leading to an even smaller, darker room at the back. I asked the landlord about it, and she simply said, "Don't go in there. It's not safe." Her eyes flickered nervously as she turned away, leaving me standing in the basement with more questions than answers. The first few nights were uneventful. I unpacked my things, settled into my new life, and started enjoying the peace and quiet of living alone. However, that peace didn't last long. The first strange occurrence happened on a rainy Thursday night. I was in the living room, trying to settle in with a book, when I heard a low thumping noise from the basement. At first, I thought it might have been the old pipes or the wind rattling something loose, but the sound persisted. It was rhythmic, almost like someone was knocking on the walls, or worse, walking through the basement, dragging something heavy behind them. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the house settling or some other natural cause. But as the noise grew louder, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next night, I was woken by a sound that chilled me to the bone. There was a soft scraping noise coming from the basement, like nails dragging across concrete. It was faint at first, but as the minutes passed, it grew louder, more desperate. I lay frozen in bed, listening to the sound, wondering if I should call the landlord. But when I glanced at the clock, I saw that it was after midnight, and I wasn't about to bother her at such an hour. The scraping stopped, but I still couldn't sleep. My mind raced with possibilities. What if there was someone in the basement? What if it was an animal or a person trapped in there, banging on the walls to get out? The next day, I decided I needed to find out what was going on. I needed to know if I was just imagining things or if something was truly amiss. I waited until the evening when the house was quiet and I ventured down into the basement. The air was colder than I expected, and the smell was stronger, what now mixed with something metallic like rust. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, but then I took a deep breath and made my way down. As I stepped into the basement, the air felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on me. The overhead light flickered weakly, casting strange shadows on the walls. The basement was exactly as I had left it, except for one thing. The door to the back room was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked toward it. I hadn't touched the door since I moved in, and yet it was open, just a crack. I could feel something pulling me toward it, as if the room itself was calling to me. I pushed the door open, my hands trembling as I did. The room beyond was small, cramped, and utterly dark. I took a step inside, my breath shallow, and scanned the room. At first, it seemed empty, but then I saw something out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape in the far corner, half hidden in the shadows. I stepped closer. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a pile of old, rotting furniture, chairs, tables, shelves, stacked haphazardly against the wall. But it wasn't just the furniture that caught my attention. There were markings on the wall. Scrawled in what appeared to be dried blood, strange symbols were painted across the concrete. Some of them looked like faces, twisted and contorted into grotesque shapes. Others were more abstract, but they all had one thing in common. They seemed to be moving, shifting, as if they were alive. I backed away slowly, my mind reeling with questions. Who had done this, and why? That's when I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the darkest corner of the room. It was so quiet at first that I wasn't sure I had heard anything at all, but then the whispering grew louder. It wasn't words, exactly, more like a low hum, a chant that made my skin crawl. I couldn't make out the language, but the tone was unmistakably sinister. My body froze as the temperature in the room dropped suddenly, the chill seeping into my bones. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The whispering turned into a low, guttural growl. I banged on the door, yelling for help, but there was no answer. The growling grew louder, and now I could hear something else. Footsteps, slow and heavy, dragging across the floor toward me. I turned to face the source of the noise, but the room was empty. No one was there, except for the shadows. The darkness seemed to grow, twisting and writhing as if alive. I could see shapes moving in the corners of my vision, but every time I looked directly at them, they vanished. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move, unable to breathe. The whispering grew into a screech, deafening in its intensity, and then nothing. Silence. I don't remember how I escaped that night. All I know is that I woke up the next morning in my bed, drenched in sweat, my heart racing. I didn't leave the apartment for 3 days. When I finally gathered the courage to go back down to the basement, the door to the back room was closed again, and everything seemed calm, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. I never spoke to the landlord again. I moved out as soon as I could by leaving the key under the mat and never looking back. I couldn't explain what had happened to me that night. I still don't understand what was in that basement, or why it had let me go. I later learned that the house had a history, a dark history. A series of disappearances had occurred in the area over the years, and some of the missing people had been last seen near Chestnut Street. But no one ever mentioned the basement. No one talked about the strange symbols on the walls or the whispers in the dark. I don't know if anyone ever moved in after me. I don't think I want to know. But sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in bed, I can still hear it. The whispering, the growling, the footsteps dragging slowly toward me. And I know that whatever was in that basement, whatever dark force had waited for me, is still there, waiting for the next person to make the mistake of stepping into its domain. Story the end.
Story number 2.
We moved into the old house when I was just a kid. My family didn't have a lot of money, but we were able to purchase the house because it was cheap. The previous owners had left in a hurry, and the house had been empty for several months before we moved in. The house was huge, too big for just the 4 of us. It sat at the end of a long, winding road on the outskirts of town. We were far enough away from the other houses that the place felt isolated, almost as if it were purposely hidden from the world. The first thing I noticed about the house was the basement. We didn't think much of it at first. It was a normal basement, or so we thought. The door to it was located in the corner of the kitchen. It wasn't a very big door, and it looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was a little rust on the handle, and the wood around the edges of the door had warped. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was the way the air smelled whenever you opened it. It was an odd mixture of dust, old wood, and something else I couldn't put my finger on. It wasn't a smell you would expect from a normal basement. I remember the first time I went down there. It was a Saturday afternoon, and my parents were busy unpacking boxes. I had nothing to do, so I decided to check out the basement. The door creaked as I opened it, and the stale, musty air rushed up to meet me. The stairs leading down were steep and narrow, covered in dirt and grime. There was no light, just a small window near the top that barely let in any daylight. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed an old flashlight and started down. The basement felt different from the rest of the house. It wasn't just the smell, it was the atmosphere. It was cold down there, colder than the rest of the house, and it felt heavy, as if the air itself was weighted down. The flashlight flickered as I moved through the dust-covered room, its beam illuminating old boxes and broken furniture. But what caught my attention wasn't the debris scattered across the floor. It was the wall at the far end of the basement. It looked wrong, like it didn't belong. The wall was cracked, but there was something strange about the cracks. They were irregular, as if something had been pushing against it from the other side, and there was a dark stain at the bottom of the wall, like something had seeped through. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if the wall was hiding something. Something that didn't want to be found. I didn't tell my parents about it. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was because I didn't think they would believe me, or maybe I just didn't want to worry them. But every time I went into the basement after that, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something down there, something watching me. I started avoiding the basement, telling myself that it was just my imagination. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Months passed, and life went on as usual. We settled into the house, but the basement continued to haunt me. I would sometimes hear noises coming from down there at night, faint thumping sounds, like something was moving. I would lay awake in bed, listening, my heart pounding. But when I got the courage to go downstairs and check, the basement was always empty, just boxes, furniture, and dust. Nothing more. Then, one night, it happened. I was in my room, getting ready for bed, when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps in the hallway. At first, I thought it was my parents coming to check on me, but then the footsteps stopped right outside my door. I froze, listening. The door to my room creaked like someone was trying to open it, but it was locked. I was too scared to move. The door rattled a few times before the footsteps started again, this time moving toward the stairs. The air in my room grew thick, and I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, heavy, ragged, like someone struggling to catch their breath. I stayed perfectly still, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could hear them on the stairs, right outside my door. Then the door to my room suddenly burst open. I screamed, but no one was there. The room was empty. There was nothing. I bolted out of bed, ran to the hallway, and looked down the stairs. The house was completely still. No one was there. My parents were asleep, and the only sound was the creaking of the floorboards above me. But the smell, the same musty, earthy smell from the basement, was stronger than ever, filling the air like it was closing in on me. I rushed downstairs to check the basement, though I wasn't sure why. I had to know if something was down there, something that was causing these strange occurrences. As I descended into the basement, the air grew even colder. My breath fogged in front of me, and the light from my flashlight flickered. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting in the corners of the room. I focused on the far wall, the wall with the cracks, and I noticed something new. There was a dark shape at the base of the wall, something I hadn't seen before. I moved closer, my hands trembling as I shone the flashlight at the shape. It was a hole in the wall, hidden behind the shadows. It wasn't large, just big enough for me to fit through. I wasn't sure what possessed me to crawl through it, but I felt a strange compulsion to do so. I crawled through the hole, my body scraping against the rough stones. When I emerged on the other side, I found myself in a small, narrow room. The room was pitch black, the air thick with the scent of decay. My flashlight illuminated something on the floor, a pile of old, rotting cloth like discarded rags. I reached down to touch them, and that's when I noticed something else. Something that made my stomach churn. At the bottom of the pile were bones. Not just animal bones, but human bones. Small, brittle, and broken. I jumped back in horror, stumbling over my own feet as I scrambled to get out of the room. But before I could turn around, I heard it. A voice. Low, guttural, barely a whisper, but it was enough to freeze me in place. Now! The voice wasn't human. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, as if the very walls of the house were speaking to me. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted back through the hole in the wall and into the basement, but as I turned to climb the stairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The door to the basement was wide open. I hadn't opened it. I didn't look back as I ran up the stairs and slammed the door behind me. My heart pounded in my chest, my body trembling with fear. I locked the door and barricaded it with anything I could find, too scared to even think about what might be lurking on the other side. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake, listening for any sign of movement, any noise that might tell me that whatever was in the basement was coming for me. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence of the house. The next day, I told my parents everything. I begged them to leave the house, but they didn't believe me. My dad even went down into the basement himself, convinced I was just being dramatic. He came back up after a few minutes, shaking his head, saying there was nothing down there. But I knew what I'd seen, what I'd heard. We never spoke of the basement again. We stayed in that house for another year, but I never went near the basement again. I couldn't. Something was down there, something that was waiting, watching. Finally, we moved out. My parents said we needed a change of scenery, but I knew the real reason. The house was no longer ours. It never had been. It had always belonged to whatever was hiding in that basement. Even now, when I close my eyes at night, I can still hear the faint sound of footsteps on the stairs, the whispers, the scraping. And I know deep down that whatever was down there is still waiting, and it's not finished with me yet. Story the end.
Story number 3.
When we first moved into the house, I had no idea what was in store for me. It wasn't a huge house, just an old 2-story with peeling paint and a crooked front porch, but it had character. My parents were thrilled about the price. The previous owners had moved out of state, leaving the place behind after decades of neglect. The house sat on a quiet street, one of those where the only noise you'd hear in middle of the night was the wind rustling through the trees. I wasn't thrilled. I was 14 at the time, and I didn't want to leave our old home in the city. But there we were, moving into a small, sleepy town, surrounded by fields and trees, and more silence than I'd ever been comfortable with. The house was everything my parents had hoped for. It had a nice-sized backyard, a garden that had long since been overtaken by weeds, and enough space for all of us to spread out. My bedroom was upstairs, the back corner room with a view of the woods behind the house. I didn't mind it at first, except for one thing. The basement. The basement door was in the kitchen, tucked away behind the refrigerator. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was just a door, old, with a brass handle and a thick layer of dust. My mom often remarked on how much work the house needed, but she was excited to roll up her sleeves and get started. She had grand plans for renovating the place, and to her, this house was a fixer-upper full of potential. We didn't go down to the basement much at first. It wasn't a finished space, just bare concrete floors and exposed wooden beams. But I always had the sense that something wasn't right down there, something unspoken about the place. Maybe it was the way the basement seemed colder than the rest of the house, even in the middle of summer. Or how every time I passed by the door, I felt a tug at the back of my mind, something telling me not to open it. One evening, after my mom had gone to bed, I found myself standing in front of that basement door. I'd never been inside, but I was curious in a way that felt almost dangerous. The house creaked and groaned as the night settled in, the wind picking up outside. I stood there staring at the old, rusty handle. Something about it beckoned me. I finally opened it. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep. I flicked the light switch, and a weak bulb sputtered to life. It hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows on the walls. The smell hit me first, musty, damp, a faint scent of mildew mixed with something else. Something deeper, like rot. I hesitated at the top of the stairs, my feet rooted to the floor. I could almost hear something moving down there, like a slow scraping noise against the concrete. But I stepped forward, cautiously, one foot after the other. The stairs creaked under my weight, the sound sharp and hollow in the quiet basement. At the bottom of the stairs, the space opened up into a wide room. Old shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes of what I assumed were the previous owner's forgotten belongings. A few old chairs and a table sat in the corner, covered in dust. I moved cautiously deeper into the room. My flashlight flickered for a moment, and I could have sworn I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I froze, holding my breath. The basement was completely still. I tried to shake the feeling off, chalking it up to nerves, but the air down there felt thick. It was like something was watching me. I began to turn back, but then I saw it. In the farthest corner of the basement, hidden behind a stack of old wooden crates, was another door. It was small, nothing like the other door to the basement. This one was made of old, dark wood, the paint chipped and peeling. A thick iron bolt secured it, but what caught my eye was what was carved into the wood. The symbol. It was barely visible at first, just faint lines running across the surface of the wood, but as I stepped closer, I could see it more clearly. It was a symbol I'd never seen before, something that looked almost like a twisted spiral with jagged lines extending outward. I reached out to touch it, my fingers brushing against the cool, rough surface. As soon as I did, a chill ran through me, like the temperature in the room had dropped several degrees. I yanked my hand away and the scratching sound started. It was quiet at first, like something small dragging across the floor, but it grew louder, closer. I looked around, heart pounding in my chest. The shelves were empty. The room was still. The noise stopped as abruptly as it had started, and I stood there, trying to make sense of what I'd just heard. My hands were shaking as I turned to leave. I didn't need to be down there anymore. But when I reached the top of the stairs and turned to close the basement door, I saw something in the corner of my eye. There was someone standing at the bottom of the stairs. It wasn't clear at first, just a figure. A shadow, really. But the longer I stared, the more I could make out the shape of a person. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its face was obscured in the darkness. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its presence like a weight pressing on my chest. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back. I slammed the basement door shut and bolted it from the inside. I didn't tell my parents about what had happened. My mom would have said it was just my imagination, and I wasn't about to deal with that. But after that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house wasn't as empty as it seemed. For weeks, I couldn't get the image of that figure out of my head. I'd hear strange noises at night, scratching sounds that seemed to come from the walls, from the basement. But when I went downstairs to check, everything was always silent. My parents started to notice that I was jumpier than usual, but they never put two and two together. They didn't hear the things I did. And then one evening, I saw something else. It was just after sunset. My parents had gone out, and I was alone in the house. The air was thick with humidity, and I could feel the weight of it pressing in on me as I moved through the rooms. I went into the kitchen to grab a snack, but when I turned to leave, I stopped short. The basement door was open. I hadn't opened it. I had locked it the night I'd first seen the figure, and I hadn't been near it since. But now it was wide open, the dim light from the basement spilling into the kitchen. I stood frozen, staring at the doorway. My pulse raced in my ears. I could hear the soft sound of something scraping against the floor, the same sound I'd heard before. I didn't want to go near it, but I couldn't just ignore it. I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the door. As soon as I stepped into the basement, I felt that same cold air rush at me, like the place itself was breathing. The light flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't what I found. The basement was different. It felt wrong. The symbol on the door had changed. It was darker now, as if someone had been adding to it over time. The air was thick with dust and something darker, something oppressive. And at the far end of the room, the door I had seen before, the one with the iron bolt, was open. I couldn't see what was inside, but I could feel it. Something was waiting in there, something I couldn't explain. Suddenly, the basement light flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, I felt something shift. A whisper brushed against my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. My breath caught in my throat, and my heart hammered in my chest. The air grew colder still. I ran. I didn't look back as I slammed the basement door shut, but I heard something following me, dragging across the floor, closer and closer until I was safely upstairs. I locked myself in my room that night and never went back down to the basement. In the days that followed, the strange noises only increased. There were footsteps, slow, dragging steps that echoed through the house at night, whispering voices, low and guttural, that seemed to come from the walls. But the worst part was the scratching. It was relentless, growing louder and more frantic as the days went on. It wasn't coming from the basement anymore. It was coming from behind the walls. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I couldn't stand the feeling that something was waiting for me in that basement, something I had no business uncovering. I packed my things and left. I don't know where my family went after that, but I couldn't stay. To this day, I've never returned to that house. I still hear the scratching sometimes, even in my new home, and I'm convinced it's the same sound, the same thing, still calling out to me from the darkness beneath the floorboards. Whatever it was, it never let me go. Story the end.
Story number 4.
We moved into the house on 4th Street the summer I turned 16. It was an old two-story place built in the early 1900s with a sagging porch, peeling paint, and a backyard that stretched out far enough to feel like it could go on forever. My mom was drawn to it immediately. She loved the large, open spaces, the potential for a garden, and the hardwood floors that ran through the main level. It was a little more expensive than we had originally planned, but she convinced my dad that it was worth the investment. We signed the lease, and I quickly learned that, despite the charm of the house, there was something deeply wrong with it. It wasn't the kind of wrong you could put your finger on at first glance, just a general unease that settled into the house like dust. The air was always a little too cold, the shadows a little too long. My dad didn't believe in anything supernatural, so when I mentioned it to him, he just dismissed it as my overactive imagination. I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The basement, in particular, was the most unsettling part of the house. It was accessed through a narrow door off the kitchen, with steep stairs that creaked and groaned with every step. I wasn't allowed down there unless I had to grab something from the laundry area, which I hated doing because the temperature was always significantly lower in the basement. The air had a musty smell that made me gag, like old mold and rot. There was something else, too, something that lurked just out of reach of your senses, like the feeling of being watched. I'd try to hurry when I had to go down there, keeping my head low, avoiding looking at the corners or the dark, shadowy corners where the light didn't quite reach. The first time I heard it was late one night when I was alone in the house. My parents had gone to a friend's house for dinner, and I was left at home to finish up some homework. I had just settled on the couch when I heard something downstairs, a faint scraping sound like something dragging along the floor. I paused, listening. It stopped. I shook it off, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling, the pipes, the wind shifting in the old walls. But then I heard it again. This time the sound was louder, closer. The scraping was followed by a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something heavy was being knocked against the wall. I froze. I had no idea what it could be. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. I got up slowly, my feet heavy on the hardwood floors as I crept to the kitchen and stood at the bottom of the basement stairs. The door to the basement was cracked open, and I could see the faintest sliver of darkness beyond. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't go down there, but something compelled me to check. Maybe it was the fear of what might be lurking down there, or maybe it was a sense of curiosity, something I couldn't shake. I grabbed the flashlight that sat by the door and slowly descended the stairs. The smell hit me first, stronger than before, thick with mildew and decay. The deeper I went, the colder the air became, and the scraping sound grew louder, almost as though it was echoing off the walls. I reached the bottom of the stairs, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was filled with boxes, old furniture, and stacks of discarded things. There was nothing unusual at first glance. But then I noticed something strange, a trail of footprints. At first I thought it was just dust, but the marks in the dirt were too distinct to be accidental. The footprints were wet, like someone had stepped through something damp and then walked across the floor. I followed the trail, my breath catching in my throat until it led to the far corner of the room. There, in the shadows, was a large old wooden chest. I didn't remember ever seeing it before, and it seemed out of place. The sound stopped abruptly, and for a moment there was complete silence. I stood there, frozen, staring at the chest. I didn't want to open it, but the overwhelming feeling of dread had me inching closer, my hand trembling as I reached for the lid. The moment my fingers touched the wood, I heard it, a soft, low groan, like something deep beneath the earth was stirring. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I yanked my hand away and stumbled back. The room felt heavier now, oppressive, as though the air itself had thickened. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and I could see my breath hanging in the air, a cloud of white. Without thinking, I ran upstairs, slamming the basement door behind me and bolting it shut. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stood there for a long moment trying to calm myself down. It was just my imagination, I told myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was down there, something I couldn't explain. The next day, I couldn't bring myself to tell my parents about what had happened. I tried to act normal, but the fear lingered. Every time I passed the basement door, I could feel the pull, the strange, unsettling sensation that something was waiting for me in the dark. That night, I decided to go back down. I wasn't sure what I was hoping to find, but I needed to know. I had to see what was in that chest. When I reached the basement again, everything felt different. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and the silence was deafening. The basement seemed even colder than before, the shadows longer, the corners darker. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, flashlight in hand, staring at the chest. I couldn't explain it, but something about it felt alive, like it was waiting for me to make a move. I stepped forward, my feet barely making a sound on the cold concrete floor. As I approached the chest, I felt a sudden pressure in my chest, like the air was being squeezed out of me. I reached for the chest again, my hand trembling. As I lifted the lid, the sound of scraping metal filled the room, louder, sharper than before. Inside, I found nothing. There was nothing in the chest but a tattered old blanket, a few broken pieces of glass, and some odd, rusted tools. But as I peered inside, I noticed something strange. An indentation in the bottom, as if something had been there recently, something heavy. And then I heard it, a soft whisper just behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest, but there was no one there. The room was empty, still, except for the faint sound of scraping again, coming from somewhere deep in the walls. I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen, before I ran back upstairs. I locked the basement door behind me, and for the rest of the night, I didn't leave my room. The sounds didn't stop, but I ignored them. I couldn't bring myself to go down there again. The next morning, my parents asked if I was okay. I was pale, shaking, and I didn't have an explanation for what had happened. I couldn't tell them about the sounds, the whisper, or the thing that seemed to be waiting for me in the dark. That night, I couldn't sleep. The sounds continued, growing louder, like they were coming closer. I couldn't tell if they were real or if I was just losing my mind. But then, in the dead of night, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The basement door opened. Slowly. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. The sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, heavy, dragging, deliberate. Then a voice, low and guttural, came from the other side of my door. "Let me in." I ran. We left the house the next morning, abandoning everything we had there. My parents were confused, but they didn't argue. We never spoke of it again, and I've never been back to that street. I don't know what it was. All I know is that the basement in that house was a place that wasn't meant to be disturbed, and whatever was down there, it wasn't human. Story the end.
Story number 5.
When I was 19, my parents bought a new house in a small, forgotten town tucked between endless stretches of forest and farmland. The house was old, early 1900s, creaky, and strangely isolated despite being in a neighborhood with 3 other homes that looked just as abandoned. My parents were thrilled, charmed by the history and the price. I wasn't, especially not after I first saw the basement. It was accessible by a set of splintered wooden stairs behind the kitchen. The door itself was oddly heavy, like it didn't want to open unless you gave it a good shove. I remember standing at the threshold during move-in day, just staring down into the blackness below. A smell drifted up, damp concrete, rotted wood, something else I couldn't name. My mom brushed past me, laughing about the smell of old houses, and flipped the switch. A single bulb at the bottom flickered on, just casting weak, uneven light over the cracked cement floor and the unfinished stone walls. I didn't like it. I didn't even like being near the door. Every time I walked into the kitchen, my stomach twisted if the door was in my line of sight, like something was waiting on the other side, staring up at me. My parents teased me about it for weeks. A few nights after we moved in, I started hearing things. Soft, shuffling sounds coming from below when I was the only one awake. The sounds of something dragging lightly across the floor, stopping, then dragging again. At first, I thought it was just an old house settling. I told myself that over and over. One night around 2 a.m., I was sitting on the couch in the living room watching TV with the volume low. My parents had gone to bed hours ago. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the kitchen door, the one leading to the basement, creak open just a few inches. I froze. The house was completely silent except for the muted sounds of the TV. No wind outside, no pets, no open windows. The door didn't move again. I turned off the TV and sat there in the dark, heart hammering against my ribs. After about 10 minutes, I got up and quietly closed it, locking it with the small latch my dad had installed for drafts, he said. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I asked my parents if they'd ever heard noises from the basement. My dad waved me off, saying the pipes were old and noisy. My mom suggested maybe I was just anxious from the move. I wanted to believe them. I really did. But things got worse. Over the next few weeks, the dragging sounds grew louder. Sometimes I heard faint whispers, too soft to make out the words, but definitely voices. One night, when I was brushing my teeth, I glanced at the bathroom mirror and swore I saw a shadow dart across the kitchen behind me, heading toward the basement door. The weirdest thing was that none of my friends wanted to hang out at my house anymore. Not after the first visit. They didn't say it outright, but I noticed how they made excuses, how they glanced nervously at the kitchen even when we were supposed to be watching movies or playing video games. My best friend Kevin put it bluntly one night after bailing on a sleepover. Dude, your house feels wrong. Like, you're not alone there. I started avoiding the kitchen altogether after dark. I kept the basement door locked at all times. I thought maybe that would help make me feel like there was a barrier between me and whatever was down there. It didn't. One evening, while my parents were out, I heard loud banging from the basement. Not just random noises, deliberate, heavy pounding like fists slamming against the walls. It went on for almost a full minute, then stopped as suddenly as it started. I didn't call anyone. I didn't even move. I sat on the couch, every muscle in my body locked up, listening so hard my ears hurt. Later that night, when I finally worked up the nerve to go into the kitchen, I found the basement door wide open. The lock was broken. My parents didn't believe me when I told them. My dad grumbled something about cheap hardware and said he'd replace it. My mom gave me a worried look but didn't say anything. That night, I pushed a chair under the doorknob to keep it closed. It didn't matter. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the unmistakable sound of slow, heavy footsteps coming up the basement stairs. I lay in bed, paralyzed, staring at the ceiling. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. Then came a slow, deliberate knock on the kitchen door. 3 knocks. Slow. Measured. I stayed like that until the sky turned pale and the morning birds started chirping. When I finally got up the courage to check, the door was still closed. The chair was still braced against it, but I knew what I heard. I didn't want to stay there anymore. I told my parents I wanted to move out, find an apartment with friends. They thought I was being dramatic, that I just wanted independence. I let them believe that. I didn't want to sound crazy. But before I left, something happened that I still can't explain. Something that confirmed every terrible instinct I'd had since the first day we moved in. It was about a week before my move-out date. I was alone in the house again, packing boxes in my room. It was late, and I had music playing loudly through my headphones to block out any unsettling noises. At some point, I realized I needed more tape, which was downstairs in the kitchen. I almost didn't go. I almost waited until morning. But I was so close to being done that I told myself to stop being a coward. I took off my headphones and made my way downstairs. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I grabbed the tape and was about to head back up when I heard it, crying. A low, broken sobbing coming from the basement door. It wasn't loud. It sounded defeated, almost childlike. I stood there, tape in hand, listening with my heart pounding so hard it hurt. For a second, just one stupid second, I thought maybe someone was hurt down there, some squatter who had been hiding in the house. It didn't make sense, but the sound was so human, so pitiful, that it pushed past all my fear. I reached out and unlocked the door. It swung open easily. The bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered and went out, leaving nothing but blackness. The crying stopped. I stood there, straining to hear anything. A creak, a breath, anything. Then I saw something at the bottom of the stairs. It was small, maybe the size of a child, but wrong somehow. Its limbs were too long, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. I couldn't see its face, just the outline of its twisted body in the darkness. It started crawling up the stairs toward me. I slammed the door shut so hard the whole frame shuddered. I dragged the kitchen table over and shoved it against the door. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat in the living room with a kitchen knife in my hand, waiting for dawn. The next day, I packed up everything I could fit into my car and left. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't even look back. My parents stayed. They still live there. I visit them occasionally, but I refuse to sleep over. I've asked them subtly if anything strange has happened. My mom always gets this tight, distant look when I bring it up. She says everything's fine, that the house feels like home now. But sometimes when I'm there, sitting at the kitchen table, I'll catch her glancing nervously at the basement door, just for a second, and I know she hears it too. Story the end.
Story number 6.
When my uncle died, he left behind a pretty big house in upstate New York. The kind of house that looked charming at first glance, old wood paneling, ivy crawling up the brickwork, a wraparound porch. But once you looked closer, you could tell it had been neglected for a long time. Dust clung to every corner, the floorboards groaned under even the lightest step, and the whole place smelled faintly of damp earth. My parents decided we should move in and renovate it over time, partly because they thought it would be good for us financially, and partly because they didn't want the house to just rot away. I was 17 then, and honestly, the idea of moving into some creepy old house didn't thrill me, but I didn't have a choice. The first time I set foot inside, it was the basement that caught my attention. Not because it was impressive or anything, quite the opposite. It was just wrong. The door to it was heavy, made of some kind of thick wood with a large black iron handle that felt cold even though it was midsummer. When we first toured the house, Mom had tried to open it, but it stuck in the frame like it hadn't been moved in decades. Dad had to shoulder it open, and when it finally gave way, a gust of air, stale and thick, rushed past us like the breath of something ancient waking up. The light switch just inside the door didn't work. When Dad flipped it up and down a few times, nothing happened, so he muttered about old wiring and pulled out his phone flashlight. He shined it down the wooden staircase, and even with the beam cutting through the gloom, you could barely see past the bottom step. The darkness just seemed to swallow the light. I stood there looking down and got the most intense feeling I've ever had in my life, the absolute certainty that something was down there, watching us. But nothing happened. And eventually Dad and I went down to look around. The basement stretched out into several sections, an unfinished laundry area, an old workbench littered with rusted tools, and what looked like the start of a wine cellar, though there were no bottles left. At the very back of the basement was a small door set into the wall. It was shorter than the others, and something about it immediately unsettled me. The door had no knob, just a keyhole. I remember pointing it out to Dad. He shrugged and said, "Probably just a storage closet. We'll deal with it later." The first few nights in the house were uneventful, at least for everyone else. For me, sleep was nearly impossible. The sound of footsteps on the floorboards would wake me up constantly, but they weren't the heavy, deliberate footsteps you might expect. They were slow, shuffling, almost cautious, as if someone or something was trying not to be heard, but was failing just enough to keep me on edge. I convinced myself it was the house settling, or maybe the raccoons Dad had mentioned seeing around the property. Then one night, maybe a week after we moved in, I woke to the sound of knocking. Not at my bedroom door. From downstairs. 3 sharp knocks, echoing up through the house. I sat up, heart hammering against my ribs, and strained to listen. The knocking came again, this time softer, like it was being muffled. I woke Dad up and told him I thought someone was in the house. He grabbed his old baseball bat and checked everything. Every door, every window, every closet. Nothing. Finally, he pulled open the basement door. I stood a few steps behind him, peering over his shoulder. The air coming up from the basement was freezing, like the dead of winter. "Probably just drafts moving things around," Dad said after a long minute. But I didn't buy it. Neither did Mom, who insisted the next day that we bring someone in to check the locks and install better security. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. The basement started getting worse after that. At first, it was just the noises. Knocking, dragging sounds, the occasional metallic clinking like chains being moved. Then things started to disappear. I lost my phone charger one day. Mom misplaced a set of keys. Little things, but always after we heard the noises. One night, I stayed up late playing games on my laptop. Around 2 a.m., I heard the basement door creak open. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I knew my parents were asleep upstairs. I'd have heard them if they'd gotten up. The stairs leading down to the basement creaked once, twice, like something was ascending rather than descending. I turned off the laptop screen and sat there in the glow of the monitor's fading light, listening. A few seconds later, something soft and wet thudded against the wall outside my room. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. The hallway stayed quiet after that. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to creep over and peek out my door. The hallway was empty. But at the far end, near the stairs, there was a small wet handprint smeared on the wallpaper, about 3 feet off the ground. The handprint was too small to be any of ours. It looked like it belonged to a child. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I tried to show the handprint to Mom, but it was gone. Not just faded. Gone. The wallpaper was clean and dry, as if nothing had ever touched it. Mom said I was probably dreaming, but I knew better. I started locking my door at night after that. It didn't help. One evening, while Dad was working late and Mom was out grocery shopping, I heard someone calling my name from the basement. It was faint at first, almost like the wind. I ignored it. Then it came again, louder. It was a child's voice, high-pitched and trembling, pleading. Please help me. It took everything in me not to run out the front door. I sat there, heart pounding, trying to convince myself I was hearing things. But then the voice said my name again, dragging it out into a long whimper. It sounded like it was right at the top of the basement stairs. I wanted to believe it was some kind of prank, but deep down I knew it wasn't. It didn't sound right. There was something wrong with it, something hollow and broken. I stayed frozen in my chair until Mom got home. I told her everything. She gave me a tight hug and promised we'd look into it. That weekend, we hired a local handyman to inspect the basement and see if maybe some animal had gotten in and was causing the noises. He didn't even make it halfway down the stairs before he came back up, white as a sheet. He told my parents, in a voice that barely kept from shaking, that there was something wrong with the foundation and that they should call a specialist immediately. Then he left without asking for payment. That night, I heard scratching at my bedroom door. Not light scratching like a cat or something. Heavy, insistent scraping like someone dragging their nails along the wood. It went on for hours. I lay in bed with the covers pulled up to my chin, tears running down my face, too scared to move. In the dim light from the street lamp outside, I saw my doorknob twist once, twice, before stopping. The next morning, I found deep gouges in the wood around the knob. The specialist Dad called out to inspect the basement said the house was structurally sound, but he wouldn't go near the back wall where the small locked door was. He said it felt colder over there, and he joked about the place being haunted. None of us laughed. Then things escalated. I started seeing things. In the reflection of the TV when it was turned off, I saw a figure standing behind me. Short, hunched, with impossibly long arms. When I turned around, nothing was there. In the bathroom mirror, I'd catch glimpses of a small shadow darting behind me, just out of reach. One night I woke up and found muddy footprints leading from the basement door to the foot of my bed. They were child-sized, barefoot, and they ended right at my mattress. That was when I snapped. I begged my parents to move, to sell the house, to burn it down if they had to. They thought I was just overwhelmed, that maybe the stress of moving was getting to me. I felt completely alone. Then Mom saw it. She was doing laundry one afternoon when she opened the basement door and found the little locked door at the back wide open. She swore up and down she'd never found a key, never opened it. But there it was, yawning open into blackness. Inside, she said, were stairs, going even deeper underground. She didn't go down them. She slammed the basement door and locked it. She refused to go near it after that. Dad nailed the door shut the next day. I thought maybe it was over, that maybe whatever was in the basement, we had trapped it. But that night I heard it again, scraping at my bedroom door, and then somehow from inside my room, a small voice whispering my name. We moved out a week later. The house stayed empty after that. No one wanted to buy it. Last I heard, it was still there, slowly falling apart, the basement door still nailed shut. But sometimes I wonder if that was enough. Because even now, years later, sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I swear I can still hear it. The soft, wet thudding against the wall, the careful, shuffling footsteps. And once, just once, I heard it whisper my name from the closet. Story. The end.
Story number 7.
The house I grew up in was 100 years old at least. Creaky floors, narrow staircases, and a basement that felt colder than the rest of the house even in the dead of summer. My parents never did much with the basement. They used it for storage, boxes stacked high with dusty Christmas decorations, old clothes, my dad's broken tools he promised to fix but never did. The air always smelled stale down there, heavy with the weight of years gone by. I was 15 when we moved in, and I hated it from the beginning, especially the basement. The first time I went down there helping my dad unload boxes, I swear I heard whispering, faint, just on the edge of hearing, like a breeze curling through the concrete. Dad brushed it off, said it was the house settling. But houses don't settle in ways that make the hairs on your arms stand straight up. There was a door at the back of the basement, a heavy wooden thing with a rusted iron handle. It was locked, and my parents told me not to worry about it. Probably just an old coal chute or a storage room, Dad said, waving it off. But the door didn't look like it had been used in decades. The wood was splintered, darkened by time, and something about it made my stomach knot every time I saw it. I tried not to think about it, but things got harder to ignore. Some nights, lying awake in bed, I'd hear it. The creak of the basement steps, one by one, slow and deliberate. I'd hold my breath and stare at my ceiling, praying it was the house, praying it was just my imagination. I told my parents once. Mom laughed it off, said I was just adjusting to a new place. Dad barely looked up from his newspaper. One night, about 3 months after we moved in, I woke to the sound of a soft thud, like something heavy being dropped on the basement floor. Then came the footsteps, heavy and dragging. Not the sharp, quick steps of someone walking, but the sluggish pull of something half dead. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I just lay there, heart hammering so loud I thought it would explode. In the morning, I found long, muddy smears on the floor leading from the basement door to the kitchen. Dad yelled at me for tracking in dirt, even though I hadn't been downstairs. He didn't listen when I swore it wasn't me. I started keeping my bedroom door locked at night. It didn't help. Every night, without fail, I heard it. The door to the basement creaking open, slow footsteps scraping against the floorboards, the soft scratch of nails against the walls. Once, I woke up to the sound of breathing, right outside my bedroom door. Heavy, wheezing, like whatever was out there was struggling to breathe. I didn't sleep much after that. About a week later, my parents went out for dinner, leaving me alone. I told them I didn't want to be left by myself, but they brushed it off, said I was old enough to handle it. It was around 9 p.m. when the power went out. The house plunged into darkness so complete I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I fumbled for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and tried to stay calm. Then I heard it, the basement door creaking open. I froze, staring down the hallway toward the stairs. The sound of slow, deliberate steps echoed through the house. I backed into the kitchen, trying to find something to defend myself with, but all I could find was a dull butter knife. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold it. The steps grew louder, closer. Then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, where the light from my phone barely reached, a figure was standing, not moving, just standing there, hunched over, head cocked at a strange, unnatural angle. Its skin was gray, almost translucent, stretched too tight over a skeletal frame. It had no eyes, just dark, sunken holes where its eyes should have been. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. It started to shuffle toward me, dragging one foot behind the other. The air grew colder with every step it took. My breath came in ragged gasps, each one visible in the freezing air. The thing reached out a hand, long, bony fingers tipped with jagged nails, and I finally broke out of my paralysis. I turned and bolted out the back door, running barefoot into the night. I didn't stop until I reached the end of the street. I sat on the curb, crying and shaking, until my parents pulled up an hour later, furious and confused. I told them everything. They didn't believe me. They never believed me. Things got worse after that. The thing from the basement started appearing more often, in mirrors, in dark corners, even in my dreams. I'd wake up with scratches on my arms, deep and bloody. My parents accused me of self-harming, sent me to a therapist. I tried to tell the therapist about the basement, about the thing, but he just smiled and scribbled notes on his pad. One night, I decided to prove it was real. I set up an old video camera at the top of the basement stairs, pointed down. I sat up all night watching the feed on my laptop. At first, nothing happened, just the still darkness of the basement. Then around 3 a.m., the door at the bottom of the stairs swung open on its own. The camera feed crackled with static. Through the grainy footage, I saw something crawling up the stairs. Not walking, crawling like a spider, limbs bending in ways they shouldn't. Its head turned completely backward as it dragged itself up, mouth stretched in a horrible, silent scream. I slammed the laptop shut and ran to my parents' room, sobbing. They were furious at being woken up, but agreed to look at the video. When we opened the laptop again, the video file was gone, deleted. No trace of it ever existing. Dad muttered something about corrupted files and went back to bed. Mom made me sleep with the door open that night. She thought it would help. It didn't. The next morning, the basement door was wide open. Deep gouges were carved into the walls all the way up the stairs, as if something had clawed its way out. After that, I refused to stay in the house alone. I started spending more time at friends' houses, making excuses to stay away. I begged my parents to move, but they wouldn't. They were convinced it was all in my head. Then my little brother, Josh, started sleepwalking. It started small, wandering into the hallway at night, mumbling nonsense. But soon he was heading for the basement. Every night, like something was calling to him. I'd find him standing at the top of the stairs, swaying slightly, his eyes wide open but blank. I'd have to shake him awake and drag him back to bed. One night, I wasn't fast enough. I woke up to the sound of Josh's footsteps, soft and steady. I ran into the hallway and saw him at the basement door. It was open, yawning blackness waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Josh started down the steps, slow and mechanical. I screamed his name and ran after him. The moment I crossed the threshold of the basement, the door slammed shut behind me. The darkness was absolute. I could hear Josh ahead of me, still walking, but when I called out to him, he didn't respond. I stumbled forward, hands outstretched, heart pounding so hard it hurt. Then I heard it, breathing, not Josh's. Something deeper, wetter, like lungs full of water. I reached out and grabbed Josh's hand. His skin was ice cold. I pulled him to me, but he fought me, struggling and thrashing like a fish on a line. In the pitch black, I felt another hand brush against my arm, slimy, cold, inhuman. I screamed and pulled Josh up the stairs with all my strength. The door wouldn't budge at first, as if something was pushing against it from the other side. I slammed my shoulder into it over and over until finally it burst open, and we tumbled out into the hallway. Josh woke up screaming, his eyes wild with terror. My parents came running, but when they saw the claw marks on my arms, they finally believed something was wrong. We moved out 2 weeks later, left everything behind. The new owners renovated the house, tore out the basement stairs, poured concrete over the old floor. But sometimes late at night, I still dream about that door. I see it swinging open, smell the mold and rot pouring out. I hear the dragging footsteps, the wet breathing, the whispering, and I wonder if the thing we left behind is still down there, waiting. Story the end.
Story number 8.
When I was a teenager, my family moved into an old 2-story house at the edge of town. It was the kind of place nobody really wanted, cheap, drafty, and in need of 100 repairs. But for my parents, it was a dream. Land, space, and a project they could pour themselves into. It didn't matter to them that the previous owners had left in a hurry or that the house had been sitting vacant for years. My mom called it character. My dad called it potential. I just called it creepy. The worst part was the basement. The entrance was a narrow door in the kitchen, almost hidden behind a coat rack. The door itself was swollen from moisture and scraped loudly against the floor when you pulled it open. The light switch didn't work half the time, and even when it did, the single bulb hanging from the ceiling only lit up a small circle at the bottom of the stairs, leaving the corners of the basement swallowed in thick darkness. The air down there was always wet and smelled faintly of earth and metal, like something rotting deep under the house. My parents didn't go down there often. The washer and dryer were in a little closet upstairs, and there wasn't much need for storage. I was grateful for that. Something about the basement felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain even to myself. I hated the way sound traveled down there, how your own footsteps would echo too loud, and how sometimes you could swear you heard other footsteps when you weren't moving at all. For a while, I avoided it completely. Then one night, about a month after we moved in, my dad asked me to help him clear some junk out of the basement. He wanted to turn it into a workshop. I didn't have much of a choice. It was early evening, but the sky outside was already darkening with storm clouds. I remember how heavy the air felt when I followed my dad into the basement. We brought a couple of flashlights because we couldn't trust the light bulb down there. It swung lazily from the ceiling as if a breeze was passing through, even though the air was completely still. There was more junk than I expected. Old furniture, moldy boxes, broken lamps, and cracked picture frames. Most of it had been left behind by the previous owners. My dad started organizing piles while I poked around with my flashlight, trying not to touch anything if I could help it. That's when I noticed a door tucked into the far wall, half hidden behind a bookcase. "Hey, Dad," I called. "There's another room back here." He looked up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and came over. Together, we pushed the bookcase aside. The door was small, about half the size of a normal one, and strangely ornate, with a brass handle shaped like a twisted vine. It didn't match the rest of the house at all. "Probably just a root cellar," Dad said, but he didn't sound sure. He pulled at the handle, and the door creaked open with a groan that made my skin crawl. Beyond it was a set of stone steps leading even deeper underground. I stood there staring, feeling my heartbeat in my throat. My flashlight barely cut into the blackness. "Let's just take a quick look," Dad said. I didn't want to, but I wasn't about to admit I was scared. I followed him down, each step colder than the last. The air grew damp and sour, thick enough to choke on. At the bottom was a small, windowless room made entirely of stone. The walls were rough and black with mildew. In the center of the floor was a large iron ring bolted into the ground. My dad shined his light around, his brow furrowing. "Weird," he muttered. "Maybe they used it for storing meat or something." But there were no shelves, no hooks, nothing that made sense for a storage room. Just that iron ring and a few dark stains on the floor that looked almost black in the weak light. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned around and climbed the stairs 2 at a time, my skin prickling like 1,000 tiny needles were stabbing me. I didn't wait for Dad. I burst back into the basement and slammed the little door shut, shoving the bookcase back in front of it. When Dad came back up a few minutes later, he didn't say anything. His face was pale and tight. Neither of us mentioned the hidden room to my mom. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. At first, it was little things. Hearing the basement door creak open at night when nobody had touched it. Feeling cold drafts even when the kitchen windows were closed. Sometimes, when I was sitting alone in the living room, I'd hear faint thudding sounds coming from beneath the floor, steady and rhythmic, like someone knocking on the beams from below. One night, I woke up to the sound of the basement door slamming. I sat up, heart pounding. It was past midnight. I could hear my parents' soft snoring down the hall. I told myself it was the wind, that the storm outside had blown it open, but when I got up to check, the kitchen was silent and the air was dead still. The basement door was wide open. I stood there staring down into the blackness, paralyzed by fear. The smell coming from below was stronger now, wet, metallic, and something else, something like old blood. I closed the door as quietly as I could and locked it. The next morning, I found muddy footprints leading up from the basement stairs, across the kitchen floor, and vanishing at the threshold of the hallway. They were too big to be mine and too small to be my dad's. I tried to tell my parents, but they brushed it off. They said it was probably dirt from when we were moving boxes around. Maybe I tracked it in without realizing, but I knew better. The prints had been fresh, wet, and they hadn't led back to the basement. They had stopped in the middle of the floor, like whoever had made them had simply disappeared. That night, I dreamed I was back in the stone room, standing beside the iron ring. Only now there was something else there with me. A figure hunched in the shadows, its limbs too long, its head cocked at an impossible angle. It whispered my name over and over until I woke up screaming. I didn't sleep again that night. After that, I started avoiding the kitchen altogether after dark. I would bring snacks to my room and make excuses to stay upstairs. My parents noticed, but they thought it was just teenage moodiness. They didn't know how much worse it was getting. Sometimes, when I was alone in the house, I would hear someone moving around downstairs. Not footsteps exactly, more like dragging, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. Once, when I was in the bathroom, I caught a glimpse of a face in the mirror behind me, just for a second. It was pale, gaunt, with hollow black eyes and a mouth that hung open wider than it should have been, like a broken jaw. When I spun around, there was nothing there. I begged my parents to move. I told them I hated the house. They thought I was being dramatic. Then, one night, everything came to a head. It was raining again, hard enough that the windows rattled. My parents had gone out to dinner for their anniversary and left me home alone. I was curled up in my room with the TV blaring to drown out the sound of the storm when I heard it. The basement door slamming open, louder this time, like it had been thrown against the wall. I froze. I could hear something coming up the stairs. Heavy, wet footsteps. I scrambled for my phone, but the screen was dead. I must have left it unplugged. I could hear the footsteps reaching the kitchen now, slow and deliberate. The sound of something dragging behind them. I didn't know what to do. I crept to my bedroom door and locked it, pressing my back against it like that thin piece of wood could somehow protect me. Then the dragging sound stopped. Silence. I held my breath, straining to hear. The storm outside seemed to dim, the whole world narrowing down to the quiet house and the pounding of my heart. That's when I heard it. A soft, wet breathing sound, right outside my door. I squeezed my eyes shut, tears streaming down my face. I didn't dare move. The breathing continued for what felt like hours. Then, without warning, the doorknob rattled violently. I screamed. There was a scraping noise like nails dragging down the wood. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I stayed frozen against the door until I heard my parents' car pull into the driveway. The headlights swept across the window, and just like that, the house felt normal again. I ripped open the door and ran downstairs, nearly colliding with my mom as she came in, soaking wet and laughing about the weather. They found me sobbing and shaking. I told them everything. This time, they finally believed me. Maybe it was the look in my eyes, or maybe they had felt it too. In some small way they hadn't admitted to themselves yet. We moved out within a week. My parents sold the house to a developer who planned to tear it down and build condos. But sometimes when the rain is coming down hard and the night feels too dark, I dream of that house. I dream of the stone room beneath the basement and the iron ring bolted to the floor. And I dream of the thing that still waits there in the darkness, dragging itself slowly, patiently, up the stairs. Story the end.
Story number 9.
When my brother Adam bought the old house on Weller Street, everyone in the family thought he was crazy. It wasn't just the cracked foundation or the overgrown yard, it was the basement. Locals said the place had a bad feeling. Some whispered about accidents and disappearances, but Adam laughed it off. He said he needed the space for his woodworking projects, and the basement was perfect. The first time I visited, the smell hit me immediately. Damp earth, something sour and metallic underneath. The rest of the house was manageable with some repairs, but the basement felt different. The stairs creaked in a way that didn't sound like wood settling. It was sharper, almost like a groan. The light barely touched the corners of the room. There were places so dark it felt like you could fall into them. Adam joked about it at first, sending me videos of ghost hunting missions where he'd poke around the basement with a flashlight, narrating like a TV host. I laughed along with him, but after a few months, his messages changed. He started texting me late at night, weird, frantic notes. Have you ever heard footsteps behind you when you're alone? Something's down there. I know it. I hear it breathing sometimes. I thought he was losing sleep or getting cabin fever. When I asked if he wanted to come stay with me for a few days, he refused. He said he couldn't leave the house unattended, not after what he found behind the wall. Apparently, while trying to set up a new shelving system, Adam knocked a hole through one of the old basement walls and discovered a crawl space. Inside, he said there were old newspapers from the 1940s, a child's shoe, and something he wouldn't describe at first. Eventually, he admitted there was a small, decayed handprint in the dirt, like a child's. Not fossilized, not preserved, fresh, somehow. I told myself he was exaggerating. Stress, maybe mold exposure. But when he stopped answering my calls for 3 days straight, I drove out to Weller Street. It was worse than I remembered. The house sagged, the windows grimy and covered in some kind of film. I knocked on the door for 10 minutes before it creaked open by itself. Inside, it smelled worse than before, like a slaughterhouse after a flood. I found Adam upstairs in his bed, fully dressed, eyes open but glassy. He looked at me, but it was like he didn't really see me. His skin was pale, lips cracked and bleeding slightly. He muttered under his breath, repeating the same sentence. "It knows. It knows. It knows." I couldn't get anything else out of him. His hands were raw, the fingernails chipped and dirty, like he'd been digging. I called for an ambulance, but when they arrived, Adam fought them like a wild animal. It took 3 grown men to get him into the stretcher. I followed them to the hospital, filled out paperwork, and sat in the waiting room until dawn. When I returned to the house to grab some of Adam's things, I felt that same pressure the second I stepped inside, like the air was heavier, thicker. Against my better judgment, I went down to the basement. The first thing I noticed was the cold. It wasn't the natural chill of a cellar. It was biting, unnatural. My breath misted in the air. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw the hole Adam had made. It was bigger now, much bigger. The entire wall was torn apart and the crawl space behind it had been dug deeper, forming a narrow tunnel that disappeared into pitch black. Something moved inside the tunnel. I froze, heart hammering against my ribs. It was small, fast. I caught a glimpse, a hand, shriveled and gray, dragging itself along the dirt. But the proportions were wrong. The fingers were too long, the joints too swollen. I stumbled back, almost falling against the stairs. I heard it then, a voice, high and broken, whispering my name, not in my ear, from beneath my feet, deep underground. I ran. I didn't even stop to lock the door. The next day, the hospital called. Adam had died during the night, cardiac arrest. The doctors said his body simply gave out, but there were no signs of heart disease, no aneurysm, nothing that made sense for a healthy 30-year-old man. I didn't attend the funeral. I couldn't. I kept having dreams about the basement. Dreams where I stood at the edge of the tunnel and something inside called to me, promising that if I just stepped inside, I'd understand everything. Weeks passed. I tried to move on. I tried to forget, but the guilt gnawed at me. I hadn't helped him when he needed it most. I told myself I'd go back to the house just once to see if I could find something that explained what happened. When I arrived, the front door was open. No signs of forced entry. Inside, the house looked like it had been ransacked, but nothing of value was taken. The destruction was concentrated around the basement door, which hung crooked on its hinges. Scratches covered the surface, deep, jagged marks like claws. The stairs were worse than before, half of them rotted through. As I descended, the smell overwhelmed me. The tunnel had grown even larger, swallowing most of the basement. The dirt walls pulsed subtly, like breathing. I heard movement behind me. When I turned, I saw shapes, dozens of them, standing just beyond the reach of the dim bulb overhead. They were small, child-sized, but horribly wrong. Limbs bent in the wrong directions, heads misshapen. Some crawled, others twitched violently, and they were all staring at me. One stepped forward. It looked almost human, a little boy, maybe 6 or 7, but his face was gaunt, mouth too wide, filled with black teeth. He reached for me, and when he spoke, it was with Adam's voice. "Stay." I stumbled back, but the stairs gave way. I landed hard on the dirt floor. Pain shot up my leg. When I tried to scramble to my feet, they were already surrounding me. Their hands, cold, slimy, grasped at my clothes, my skin. They didn't drag me into the tunnel. They didn't have to. The ground beneath me split open like a mouth. The last thing I remember was falling into darkness, into the sound of thousands of whispers, each one calling my name. I woke up on my couch at home. No memory of how I got there. My clothes were caked with dirt, my shoes missing. For a moment I thought it was a nightmare. But when I looked at the bottoms of my feet, they were raw and bloody, as if I'd walked miles over broken ground. That was 3 months ago. I still hear them at night, the tapping on the windows, the scratching in the walls. Sometimes I find footprints in the carpet, small, muddy, leading from the basement up to my bedroom door. I know they followed me. I know they're waiting. I can feel the ground shifting under my house now, like something digging upwards, hungrier every day. Story the end.